Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be looking at how to alter data in a server. In the previous videos, we saw how to get data from the server, but now we're going to actually be altering different data in the server. So right now, when we add a note, it doesn't actually get sent to the server. So in this video, we're going to be implementing that. And in order to do that, we're going to go over to our save note function, which deals with saving notes. And in here, we're going to remove the set notes function, since this only sets the notes array displayed in our browser, and it doesn't actually change anything in our server. So we're going to remove it, and we're going to be looking at a new Axios function, which is the post function. And this post function takes in the URL of our server as its first input. And the second input is going to be whatever we want to send to our server, which in our case is going to be our new object, which is the note object. Then we're going to use the then function, which is going to give us a response. And in here, we're going to use the set notes function, and we're going to pass it in notes.concat, and we're going to give it response.data. Now here, response.data is going to be representing the note object. So we can also use notes.concat and we can pass in note object. It's the same with response.data. And finally, we're going to clear the input field. So we're going to use set new note and we're going to pass in an empty string. So now not only do we save the note to our notes array, but we're also going to be adding the note to our JSON server. So we can save our file and we're going to open our terminal and we're going to navigate to our folder. And first we're going to run our application using npm run dev. And in a new terminal, we're going to navigate to our project again. And in here, we're going to run our server using npm run server. Now let's head over to our browser. We can see that all our initial notes get rendered. And when we add a new note, let's say hello world, and when we press add, we get an error that says 404 not found. So this is probably because we did not provide the proper URL to our server. So we're going to head back to our application and fix that. As you can see here inside the post function, we passed in the wrong URL. We need to add /notes. So now we can save our file and head back to the browser. And now if we create a new note, we're going to say hello world and press on add. We can see that hello world gets displayed to the browser. And if we open our server and refresh it, we can see that a new object has been added, which is the new note we just created. The next thing we're going to do is add a button that is going to be used to change the importance of our notes. So we're going to head over to our note component, which is in a separate file, which is in the components folder. Inside the note component, we're going to add in one more input. We're going to call it toggle importance. And in our component, we're going to create a new variable. We're going to call it label. And we're going to pass in a ternary function. So we're going to check note.important. So if note.important is true, then we want our label to be make not important. And if our note.important is false, then we want our label to be make important. Now in our return statement, next to our content, we're going to add a button, which is going to have the text of whatever label is. So it's going to depend on the importance of our note. And we're going to also pass in an onClick function, which is going to be the toggle importance input. So we can save our component and head back to our app file. In our return statement, in the note component, we're going to pass in an additional input, which is toggle importance. And we're going to give it a value of a function. And in this function, we're going to call another function called toggle importance of, and we're going to pass in an ID. So since we have access to the current node using the map function, we're going to pass in node.id to this function. Now here you may have noticed that we didn't directly pass in the toggle importance of function. This is because our function takes in an input, and if we were to directly pass it in, the function would execute as soon as our component renders, and not when the button is clicked, which is not what we want. So whenever we have a function that takes in an input, we're going to be passing it in this way. So we're going to have another function, and inside that function, we're going to pass in whatever function we want to run when the button is clicked. If our function didn't take any input, we would pass it in like we did in previous videos, but in our case, it takes in the node's ID. So now we need to actually define this function. So we're going to have const toggle importance of, and as input is going to have an ID. And in here, we're going to define a variable called URL, and we're going to pass in a template string. So we're going to be using backticks. Then we're going to have our server link, and we're going to pass in whatever ID we have. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a custom link based on whatever ID we have. You can check this by going to your server and adding hyphen and putting in an ID. So whatever ID you put in, it's going to show you the node that matches that ID. So if you put in 1, it's going to show you the node that has ID 1. So you can check that in your browser. And once we have the URL, we're going to define another variable called node. And we're going to use a new function that we haven't used till now, which is the find function. So we're going to have nodes, which is the array. Then we're going to have our find function, which is going to find a node that matches our description. So it's going to have n as input, and we're going to return n.id is the same as the ID we pass in to our function. So this is going to find the node that matches the ID that we passed to the function, and it's going to store it in the node variable. Once we have the node, we're going to create a new object. We're going to call it change the node. And this is going to use the object spread syntax. So we're going to copy everything node has, but we want to change one attribute, which is the important attribute. And we want to set it to the opposite of whatever important is. So if important is true, then it's going to set it to false. If important is false, it's going to set it to true. Once we've done that, we're going to have an Axios function. Since we need to communicate with our server, we're going to have a new function, which is the put function. Now the put function is used to update a certain property in your server. So in our case, we're going to be updating the important property. So the first input is going to be the link to the object you want to change. So we're going to pass in our URL. And next, you're going to pass in the object you want to replace the old object with. So in our case, we're going to replace it with changed node. And then we're going to have our then function, which is going to give us a response. So we've already dealt with the server side. Now we are going to be dealing with the browser side. So we're going to use the set nodes function. And we're going to pass in nodes.map, which is going to give us a node. And in here, we're going to have a ternary function, which is going to compare nodes.id. So if node.id is not equal to whatever ID we pass into our function, in that case, we simply want to return the node. But if the node's ID matches to whatever ID we passed into our function, in that case, we want to return our changed node, which is stored in response.data. So this is going to be dealing with the browser side functionality. The next thing we're going to do is refactor our code. That means we're going to be moving the code for communicating with the server to a separate file. So we're going to head over to our source folder, and we're going to create a new folder. We're going to call it services. And in here, we're going to create a new file called node.js. And in here, we're going to have our different communication functions. So the first thing we need to do is import Axios from Axios. Next, we're going to define a variable called base URL. which is going to store the base URL of our server. So it's going to be http localhost/notes. The first function we're going to define is the getAll function, which takes no input and is simply going to return axios.get, and we're going to pass in the base URL. The next function we're going to define is a function called create, which takes in a new object as input, and it's going to return axios.post. The first input is going to be the base URL. The second input is going to be the new object. And finally, we're going to define a function called update, which takes in an ID and a new object. And this is going to return axios.put. And the first input is going to be the custom URL of the object we want to modify. So we need a template string, and we're going to pass in the base URL, hyphen, then we're going to pass in the ID. Now the second input is the new object that is going to replace the old one. So we're going to pass in new object. Once that's done, we need to export the functions. So we're going to have export default, and in curly braces, we're going to pass in the name of our different functions. So we're going to have getAll, we're going to have create, and finally, we're going to have update. Now we can save this file and head over to our app file. At the top of our app file, we're going to remove the import Axios since we don't need it anymore. Instead, we're going to be importing, let's call it Note Services. We're going to access the current directory, then we're going to head over to Services, then to Notes. In our useEffect function, we're going to remove the Axios call, and we're going to have Note Services .getAll. In our save note function, we're going to remove axios.post, and we're going to have Note Services .create, and we're going to pass in the new object, which is note object. And finally, in our toggle importance of function, we're going to remove axios.put, and we're going to have note services .update, and we need to pass in two inputs. First, we're going to pass in the ID. Next, we're going to pass in the new object, which is changed note. Before we go to the browser, we made a typo when we were importing Note Services. So we're going to remove the S since we have our communication in a file called note.js. One more thing we need to change is in our changed note object. Here, what we need to pass for the important property is the opposite of whatever note.important is, instead of simply passing in important, since important is not defined. And one final thing we need to change is another typo in our note.js file. In our update function, we put in a backslash instead of a normal slash. Now we can save our file and head to the browser. As you can see, all our notes are rendered. And if we look at the first note, it has an important attribute set to true. But if we press on our make not important button, then we change the importance to false. We can check this by going over to our server and we can refresh the page. And as you can see, the important attribute of our HTML is easy note is now false. So this has been a lesson on altering data in our JSON server. Thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel to show your support.